Sergeant First Class Michael Chen had been serving as a tomb guard at Arlington National Cemetery for 3 years, and in that time, he had witnessed every form of human emotion imaginable. Grief, pride, anger, confusion, and reverence all played out daily among the thousands of visitors who came to pay their respects to America's fallen heroes. But rarely had he seen such blatant disrespect as what he was observing from his post near the tomb of the unknown soldier. Chen's sharp eyes had picked up the disturbance in Section 60 almost immediately. Even from several hundred yards away, his trained senses could detect when something was amiss in the cemetery's careful balance of solemnity and respect. The loud voice, the casual posture, and the obvious drinking were all violations of the sacred atmosphere that Chen and his fellow guards worked tirelessly to maintain. The 28-year-old soldier had dedicated his military career to this singular purpose. Standing guard over the tomb of the unknown soldier wasn't just a job. It was a calling that required absolute perfection, unwavering dedication, and a deep understanding of what the cemetery represented. Every step Chen took during his watch was measured and deliberate. Every movement was practiced thousands of times until it became second nature. Every moment of his duty was infused with the weight of honoring those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Chen had grown up in a military family in San Francisco. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in Vietnam, and his older sister was currently deployed in Iraq. The concept of military honor wasn't abstract to Chen, it was woven into the fabric of his identity. When he'd first applied to become a tomb guard, the rigorous selection process had tested every aspect of his character, discipline, and commitment. The training to become a tomb guard was unlike anything else in the military. Candidates had to memorize detailed information about Arlington National Cemetery, the tomb of the unknown soldier, and the guards who had served before them. They studied the histories of every major American conflict, learned the names and stories of Medal of Honor recipients, and practiced their ceremonial duties until they could perform them flawlessly under any conditions. But beyond the technical requirements, becoming a tomb guard required something deeper, an understanding that they were the living embodiment of the nation's gratitude to its fallen heroes. Every person buried in Arlington had earned the right to eternal rest in a place of dignity and reverence. The guards existed to ensure that this promise was never broken. As Chen continued his measured pace at the tomb, he kept one eye on the disturbance in Section 60. The man in the leather jacket was becoming increasingly loud and agitated, his behavior clearly disturbing other visitors in the area. Chen watched as an elderly couple moved away from their own memorial visit, their peaceful moment interrupted by the inconsiderate actions of one individual. This was exactly the kind of situation that tested a tomb guard's judgment and training. The guards had authority throughout Arlington National Cemetery, not just at the tomb itself. They were empowered to maintain order and ensure that all visitors showed appropriate respect for the sacred ground. But they also understood that grief took many forms, and sometimes people acted out of pain rather than malice. Chen had dealt with similar situations before. Usually, a quiet word and a gentle reminder of where they were was enough to redirect someone's behavior. Most people, when approached respectfully by a tomb guard, immediately understood the gravity of their actions and corrected course. The uniform commanded respect, and the guard's reputation for absolute professionalism usually diffused tense situations quickly, but something about this particular situation felt different to Chen. The Deary man's body language suggested more than just grief. There was an anger and defiance that seemed directed at the cemetery itself, at what it represented. The way he'd discarded his beer can near the grave showed a deliberate disregard for the sacred nature of the space. This wasn't someone who was simply overwhelmed by emotion. This was someone who was actively choosing to be disrespectful. Chen's radio crackled softly with routine communications from other posts around the cemetery. The changing of the guard would happen in another hour, and there was a full military funeral scheduled for 2 p.m. The rhythm of the cemetery's daily operations continued around him, but Chen's attention remained focused on the brewing problem in Section 60. The man had opened a second beer and was now speaking even more loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. Chen could see other visitors beginning to look in that direction, their own moments of remembrance disrupted by the inappropriate behavior. A young mother was quickly leading her children away from the area, clearly uncomfortable with the language and attitude they were witnessing. Chen made his decision. After completing his current circuit at the tomb, he would make his way to Section 60 and address the situation directly. As a tomb guard, he had both the authority and the responsibility to ensure that Arlington remained a place where all visitors could pay their respects in an atmosphere of dignity and peace. The process would be handled according to strict protocol. Chen would approach the individual calmly and professionally, identify himself and his authority, and explain the expectations for behavior within the cemetery. Most people responded positively to this approach, grateful to be reminded of the proper way to honor the fallen. The vast majority of visitors wanted to do the right thing. They just sometimes needed guidance. But Chen was also prepared for the possibility that this individual might not respond well to correction. The man's aggressive body language and apparent intoxication suggested that a confrontation was possible. In such cases, the guards were trained to remain absolutely professional while being firm about the cemetery's standards. They had backup available if needed, but the goal was always to resolve situations with minimal disruption to other visitors. As Chen continued his precise movements at the tomb, he reflected on why this duty mattered so much to him. Every person buried in Arlington had made sacrifices for their country. Some had died in combat, others in training accidents, still others from wounds sustained in service. Each grave represented not just an individual life, but also the families and communities that had been forever changed by their loss. The unknown soldiers buried beneath the tomb, where Chen stood guard, represented all of those who had died in service but could never be identified or returned to their families. They were symbols of every mother who never knew what happened to her son, every wife who never got closure, every child who grew up without a father. Protecting their rest and the rest of all those buried in Arlington was both an honor and a sacred duty. Chen checked his watch and noted the time. In exactly 17 minutes, he would complete his current duty period at the tomb and make his way toward Section 60. He hoped that by then, the situation would have resolved itself naturally. Perhaps the man would finish his business and leave on his own, or perhaps another visitor would help him understand the inappropriateness of his behavior. But if not, Sergeant First Class Michael Chen was prepared to do what 3 years of training and a lifetime of military values had taught him to do: protect the dignity of America's fallen heroes, no matter what it cost him personally. Tank had lost track of time as he stood at Danny's grave, his second beer now half empty and his voice growing louder with each passing minute. The alcohol was doing its job, dulling the sharp edges of his pain and replacing them with a familiar rage that felt easier to manage than grief. He was deep into telling Danny about how their father had started drinking heavily after the funeral, how their mother had become a shadow of herself, and how the whole family had basically fallen apart. "You know what really gets me, Danny?" Tank said, swaying slightly as he gestured with his beer can. "All these people walking around here acting like this place is so sacred, like it means something. But where were they when you needed help? Where was all this respect when you were alive and struggling?" A small group of tourists had approached the section but quickly turned around when they heard Tank's loud, profanity-laced monologue. Tank noticed them leaving and felt a surge of satisfaction. Good, he thought. Let them see what real grief looks like instead of their polite, sanitized version of mourning. Tank's motorcycle boots scuffed against the perfectly maintained grass as he paced back and forth in front of Danny's headstone. The cemetery groundskeepers had done their usual immaculate job. Every blade of grass was the same height, every edge was perfectly trimmed, every detail was maintained with military precision. It annoyed Tank somehow, all this perfection surrounding so much death and pain. "They got you all dressed up in this fancy cemetery," Tank continued, his voice echoing off nearby headstones. "But they couldn't dress up the war that killed you, could they? Couldn't make that pretty and neat and organized like these stupid rows of graves." Tank crushed his empty second beer can and tossed it next to the first one near Danny's headstone. He was reaching for his third beer when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Not the shuffling steps of elderly visitors or the quick pace of tourists, but measured, deliberate steps that seemed to ring with authority even on the soft grass. Tank turned around and found himself facing a young soldier in an immaculate dress blue uniform. The man's posture was ramrod straight, his uniform pressed to perfection and his shoes polished to a mirror shine. But it was his eyes that caught Tank's attention. They were steady, alert, and completely focused on Tank with an intensity that was immediately unsettling. "Sir," the soldier said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable tone of command. "I'm Sergeant First Class Chen with the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment. I need to speak with you about your behavior in the cemetery." Tank felt a surge of defiance rise in his chest. Who was this kid to tell him how to behave at his own brother's grave? Tank was older, bigger, and angrier, and he wasn't about to be lectured by some toy soldier about how to mourn his family. "My behavior?" Tank said, deliberately taking a long drink from his 3rd beer. "I'm visiting my dead brother, soldier boy. Last I checked, that was still legal in America." Chen's expression didn't change, but Tank noticed the soldier's shoulders seemed to square even more, if that was possible. When Chen spoke again, his voice remained perfectly controlled, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "Sir, I understand you're here to honor a fallen service member, and I respect that. However, Arlington National Cemetery has certain standards of conduct that all visitors are expected to follow. Consuming alcohol and using profane language are not permitted anywhere on these grounds." Tank laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Standards of conduct? You want to talk to me about standards? How about the standard of keeping soldiers alive instead of sending them to die in pointless wars? How about the standard of taking care of families after their sons get killed serving this country?" Chen had dealt with grief-stricken family members before, but he could see that this situation was different. The man wasn't just mourning. He was actively hostile toward everything the cemetery represented. Still, Chen's training had prepared him for exactly this type of encounter. Remain professional, show respect for the visitor's loss, but maintain the dignity of the sacred ground. "Sir, I can see that you're dealing with a tremendous loss," Chen said, his voice softening slightly while maintaining its authority. "Every person buried in this cemetery represents a family sacrifice, and I don't want to minimize your pain. But this is hallowed ground, and all visitors have the right to pay their respects in an atmosphere of peace and dignity." Tank felt his anger spike at the soldier's calm, reasonable tone. He didn't want understanding or sympathy from this kid who probably hadn't even seen combat. He wanted someone to acknowledge the injustice of Danny's death, the unfairness of the whole system, the rage that had been consuming him for 5 years. "Hallowed ground?" Tank spat. "This is a garbage dump full of kids who died for nothing. My brother was 24 years old when he got blown up by some roadside bomb in a war that nobody even remembers anymore. And you want me to whisper and be polite about it?" Chen felt the words like physical blows, but his training held firm. He'd heard angry family members say similar things before, usually in the first raw stages of grief. But he also noticed that other visitors in the area were beginning to gather at a distance, drawn by the raised voices and obvious confrontation. This was exactly the kind of disruption that couldn't be allowed to continue. "Sir, I understand your anger, but I need you to lower your voice and dispose of the alcohol properly. If you'd like to continue your visit, you're welcome to do so, but you need to respect the other families who are here to mourn their own losses." Tank looked around and saw the small crowd that had gathered. There was the elderly veteran he'd seen earlier, now back with his wife and watching the confrontation with obvious concern. A middle-aged woman was standing near a grave about 50 yards away, clearly torn between wanting to complete her own visit and being disturbed by the scene Tank was creating. Something about seeing those other mourners made Tank even angrier. They got to have their quiet, dignified grief while his family had been destroyed by Danny's death. They got to place their flowers and say their prayers and go home feeling like they'd done something meaningful, while Tank couldn't even function normally 5 years later. "You know what?" Tank said, stepping closer to Chen and invading his personal space. "I don't think I want to lower my voice. I think I want to tell everyone here exactly what I think about this whole military hero worship garbage. Maybe it's time someone told the truth about what this place really is." Chen didn't step back, but Tank could see something change in the young soldier's posture. It was subtle, a slight shifting of weight, a barely perceptible adjustment of stance. But Tank recognized it instinctively. This kid might look like a pretty boy in his fancy uniform, but he was ready for a fight if it came to that. The realization should have warned Tank to back down, but instead, it excited him. He'd been looking for someone to blame for Danny's death for 5 years, and here was a perfect representative of everything he hated about the military machine that had chewed up his brother and spit him out in a flag-draped coffin. The tension between Tank and Chen had reached a breaking point, and both men could feel it. Tank stood less than 3 feet from the tomb guard, his beer breath mixing with the crisp autumn air, his bloodshot eyes locked on Chen's unwavering gaze. The small crowd of onlookers had grown larger, with visitors from other sections of the cemetery beginning to drift over to see what was happening. Chen could feel the weight of every eye watching him. This was more than just a disciplinary situation now. It was a test of everything he represented as a tomb guard. The people watching weren't just seeing an argument between two men. They were witnessing whether the standards and dignity of Arlington National Cemetery would be upheld or allowed to crumble under the pressure of one angry individual. "Sir," Chen said, his voice carrying across the now silent section of the cemetery, "I'm going to ask you one final time to comply with cemetery regulations. Please dispose of the alcohol, moderate your language, and respect the other visitors who are here to honor their fallen family members." Tank felt a moment of clarity cut through his alcohol-fueled rage. He looked around at the faces watching them, veterans who had served their country, families who had lost loved ones, tourists who had come to pay respects to America's heroes. For just a second, he saw himself through their eyes. A drunk, angry man making a scene at his brother's grave, turning a sacred place into a spectacle. But the moment passed quickly, overwhelmed by 5 years of accumulated bitterness and pain. Tank wasn't just angry at Chen or even at the military, he was angry at God, at fate, at a universe that would take away the best person he'd ever known and leave him alone to figure out how to keep living. "You want to know what compliance looks like?" Tank said, his voice rising to a shout. "Here's your compliance." Tank deliberately raised his beer can and took a long, exaggerated drink, then threw the half-full can directly at Danny's headstone. The aluminum container hit the white marble with a sharp crack, beer splashing across the engraved letters of his brother's name and dripping down onto the carefully maintained grass. The crowd gasped audibly at the desecration. Even Tank's alcohol-clouded mind registered that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. But instead of shame, he felt a perverse satisfaction. Finally, everyone could see the ugly truth of what loss really looked like. Stripped of all the pretty ceremonies and polite condolences, Chen felt something fundamental shift inside him as he watched the beer drip down the headstone. In 3 years as a tomb guard, he had never seen such a deliberate act of disrespect toward a fallen service member. This wasn't grief anymore. This was a direct assault on everything sacred about Arlington National Cemetery. "Sir, you are under arrest for public intoxication and desecration of federal property," Chen said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Tank laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the surrounding headstones. "You're going to arrest me, at my own brother's grave, for drinking a beer and telling the truth about what this place really is." Chen had already pressed the emergency button on his radio, summoning backup from cemetery security and military police. But he also knew that help was several minutes away and the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Tank was bigger, heavier, and clearly prepared for violence. Chen's dress blue uniform was designed for ceremony, not combat, and his primary concern was protecting the dignity of the cemetery and the safety of the civilian visitors. "Sir, I don't want to use force, but I will if necessary," Chen said, beginning to move slowly to his right, creating space between Tank and the crowd of onlookers. "Please comply with my instructions and this situation can be resolved peacefully." Tank matched Chen's movement, keeping himself between the soldier and Danny's grave. "You know what your problem is, soldier boy. You think that uniform makes you special. You think it gives you the right to tell people how to feel, how to grieve, how to remember their dead brothers." Tank's voice was getting louder with each word, his gestures more erratic. The crowd was beginning to back away, sensing that violence was imminent. An elderly veteran was helping his wife move to a safer distance, while trying to shield her from the ugly scene unfolding before them. "My brother died believing in all the same things you do," Tank continued, his finger now pointing directly at Chen's chest. "Honor, duty, service, sacrifice. All those pretty words they put on recruiting posters. And where did it get him? A hole in the ground and a family that's never been the same." Chen could see that Tank was working himself up to something, using his own words to fuel his rage. This was a pattern Chen had learned to recognize in his military training. The escalation phase before someone committed to violence. Chen's muscles tensed as he prepared for whatever was coming. "The worst part is that people like you keep the lie going," Tank said, taking a step closer to Chen. "You stand here in your perfect uniform at your perfect ceremony, making people think there's something noble about dying for a country that forgets about you the second you're buried." Chen tried one more time to de-escalate the situation. "Sir, your brother served with honor and his sacrifice matters. But right now you're dishonoring his memory with your actions. Is this really how you want to remember your visit to his grave?" The words hit Tank like a physical blow. Deep down, he knew Chen was right. Danny would be ashamed of what Tank was doing. Ashamed of what Tank had become in the years since his death. Danny had always been the better man, the one who believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. But instead of calming Tank down, this realization only made him angrier. He was angry at Chen for being right, angry at himself for proving the point, and angry at Danny for being dead and unable to help him figure out how to be a better person. "Don't you dare tell me about my brother's memory," Tank snarled, moving even closer to Chen. "You didn't know him. You didn't watch him die piece by piece in that hospital. You didn't hold his mother while she cried herself to sleep every night for 2 years." Chen could smell the alcohol on Tank's breath now, could see the pain and rage warring in the older man's eyes. He felt genuine sympathy for Tank's loss, but he also had a duty that superseded his personal feelings. Arlington National Cemetery was sacred ground, and Chen had sworn an oath to protect its dignity. "Sir, I'm sorry for your loss, but I cannot allow you to continue disrupting this cemetery," Chen said firmly. "Please step away from the grave and place your hands behind your back." Tank looked around at the crowd watching them, at the beer-stained headstone behind him, at the young soldier standing between him and what felt like his only remaining connection to his brother. Everything in his life had led to this moment, and he realized he had a choice to make that would define not just this day, but possibly the rest of his life. Tank stared at Chen for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing through 5 years of accumulated anger, grief, and self-destruction. The young soldier stood perfectly still, his uniform crisp despite the tension, his eyes never leaving Tank's face. Behind Chen, Tank could see the crowd of onlookers, their faces showing a mixture of fear, disgust, and pity that cut through his rage like a knife. In that moment of clarity, Tank suddenly saw himself as others saw him, a middle-aged man in dirty leather, drunk and belligerent at his brother's grave, making a spectacle of his pain in the most sacred place in America. The realization should have stopped him, should have made him apologize and walk away. Instead, it filled him with a final surge of desperate fury. "You know what?" Tank said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm tired of people like you pretending to understand what sacrifice means. You want to see real sacrifice? I'll show you." Tank feinted to his left, then lunged to his right, trying to get around Chen and back to Danny's grave. His plan was chaotic and desperate. He wanted to make some grand gesture, to overturn the headstone or destroy the perfect order of the cemetery in a way that would force people to see the real cost of war. But Chen was ready. 3 years of training and a lifetime of discipline had prepared him for exactly this moment. As Tank moved, Chen stepped smoothly to intercept him, his movements precise and controlled despite the chaos of the situation. Tank, driven by alcohol and emotion rather than training, stumbled as Chen blocked his path. The bigger man's momentum carried him forward, and he crashed into Chen with all his weight. Both men went down hard on the perfectly manicured grass, Tank's leather jacket scraping against Chen's dress blues. The crowd gasped, and several people screamed as the two men hit the ground. Tank was bigger and heavier, but Chen was trained, sober, and fighting to protect something he held sacred. As they grappled on the ground between the headstones, Tank tried to use his size advantage to overpower the younger man. "Get off me," Tank shouted, throwing wild punches that mostly missed their mark. "This is my brother's grave. I have every right to be here." Chen absorbed the few blows that connected, his training allowing him to stay calm even as Tank thrashed beneath him. Chen's goal wasn't to hurt Tank. It was to control him until backup arrived and the situation could be resolved safely. He used precise holds and leverage rather than brute force, trying to pin Tank without causing unnecessary injury. "Sir, stop resisting," Chen commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority even as he struggled to maintain control. "You're only making this worse for yourself." The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that help was on the way, But the fight was far from over. Tank, realizing that this might be his last chance to make his point, gathered all his remaining strength for one final effort. He managed to break free from Chen's hold and rolled away, scrambling to his feet near Danny's headstone. Tank stood swaying for a moment, his leather jacket torn and grass stains on his jeans, looking around at the circle of faces watching him. For the first time he really saw them, not as strangers or enemies, but as people like himself who had come to this place to remember someone they had lost. There was the elderly veteran, standing protectively in front of his wife, his weathered face showing not anger but profound sadness at what he was witnessing. There was the middle-aged woman Tank had seen earlier, tears streaming down her face as she watched one person's pain destroy the peace of a place where she had come to find comfort. Most powerfully, Tank saw a young woman about Danny's age, wearing an army t-shirt and holding flowers she had obviously brought for someone's grave. She was looking at Tank with an expression of heartbreak and disappointment that reminded him painfully of how Danny used to look when Tank made bad choices. Chen had also gotten to his feet, his uniform disheveled but his posture still commanding. Despite everything that had happened, his voice remained professional as he addressed Tank one final time. "Sir, this is your last opportunity to surrender peacefully," Chen said, blood trickling from a small cut on his lip where one of Tank's punches had connected. "In 30 seconds, this cemetery will be full of military police and federal agents. You can end this now with some dignity, or you can make it worse for everyone, including yourself." Tank looked down at Danny's headstone, now stained with beer and surrounded by the debris of his emotional breakdown. He thought about what his brother would say if he could see this scene. His older brother drunk and fighting at his grave, turning his final resting place into a battleground. Danny had always been the voice of reason in Tank's life, the one who talked him out of bar fights and bad decisions. Even as kids, Danny had been the peacemaker, the one who could calm Tank down when his temper got the better of him. What would Danny think about Tank using his grave as an excuse for violence and disrespect? The sirens were getting closer now, and Tank could see military vehicles approaching through the cemetery gates. In a few minutes, this place would be swarming with law enforcement, turning Danny's grave into a crime scene. The thought of police cars and handcuffs and reporters at his brother's final resting place finally broke through Tank's wall of anger. Tank looked at Chen, then at the watching crowd, then back at the beer-stained headstone. For the first time in years, he felt genuine shame about his actions. Not just regret or self-pity, but real shame at having dishonored his brother's memory and turned a sacred place into a spectacle. "Danny," Tank whispered to the headstone, his voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "I'm sorry, little brother. I'm so sorry." Tank slowly raised his hands and placed them behind his head, the universal gesture of surrender. His shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him completely, leaving only exhaustion and the dawning realization of what he had done. Chen approached carefully, still maintaining his professional demeanor, despite the physical altercation they had just endured. As he moved behind Tank to secure his hands, Chen spoke quietly, his voice intended only for Tank to hear. "Sir, I want you to know that I understand you're in pain," Chen said as he gently but firmly guided Tank's hands into position. "What happened here today doesn't define your brother's service or your love for him." Tank felt tears he hadn't shed since Danny's funeral beginning to well up in his eyes. The kindness in Chen's voice, even after everything Tank had put him through, was almost harder to bear than anger would have been. It reminded him that there were still good people in the world, people like Danny had been, people who chose to serve others even when it cost them something. The military police vehicles pulled up nearby, their red and blue lights flashing silently out of respect for the sacred nature of the cemetery. Several officers approached the scene, but Chen raised his hand to indicate he had the situation under control. As Tank stood with his hands secured behind his back, he looked around at the faces of the people who had witnessed his breakdown. The anger and fear he had seen earlier had been replaced by something else. Not pity exactly, but a kind of understanding that surprised him. These people, he realized, had all experienced loss. They knew what grief could do to a person, even if they had never let it take them as far as Tank had gone. The elderly veteran approached slowly, his wife hanging back but watching with concern. Tank expected condemnation, but instead the old man's voice was gentle when he spoke. "Son," the veteran said, "I lost my best friend in Vietnam 47 years ago. I know the anger you're feeling. But this place isn't for anger. It's for remembering the good things about the people we lost. Tank tried to speak but found his voice wouldn't work. The simple compassion from someone who had every right to judge him harshly was breaking down the last of his defenses. 5 years of anger and bitterness were finally giving way to the grief he had been avoiding. Chen completed the formal arrest procedure with quiet efficiency, reading Tank his rights in a voice that carried no triumph or satisfaction. As the military police prepared to transport Tank from the cemetery, Chen made an unexpected request. "Sir, would you like a moment to properly say goodbye to your brother before we leave?" Chen asked. "I can arrange for the headstone to be cleaned and you can have a few minutes of privacy." Tank looked at Chen in amazement. After everything that had happened, after the disrespect and violence, this young soldier was still thinking about Tank's need to honor his brother's memory. It was exactly the kind of gesture Danny would have made, putting compassion ahead of protocol, seeing the person behind the problem. Tank nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. Chen spoke quietly to the military police officers who stepped back to give Tank some space, while remaining close enough to maintain security. A cemetery groundskeeper appeared with cleaning supplies and quickly removed the beer stains from Danny's headstone, restoring it to its pristine condition. Tank knelt beside the grave, his hands still secured behind his back. But his heart finally opened to the grief he had been carrying for 5 years. For the first time since Danny's death, Tank spoke to his brother not in anger or bitterness, but in love. "I'm sorry, Danny," Tank whispered. "I'm sorry I let you down and I'm sorry I dishonored you today. You deserved better from me. You always deserved better." Tank thought about all the conversations he and Danny had shared about right and wrong, about taking responsibility for your actions, about being the kind of man who made his family proud. Danny had lived those values every day of his life, right up until the moment he died serving his country. Tank had spent 5 years doing the opposite. "I promise I'll do better," Tank continued, his voice growing stronger. "I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. I'll make you proud of me again, little brother. I promise." Tank felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see Chen standing beside him. The young soldier's face showed no anger or judgment, only respect for a brother's love and a family's loss. "Your brother would be proud that you came here today," Chen said quietly. "Sometimes we have to hit bottom before we can start climbing back up." As Tank was led away from the cemetery, he looked back one final time at Danny's grave. The headstone gleamed white in the afternoon sun, clean and dignified once again. The other visitors had returned, 3 months after his arrest at Arlington National Cemetery. Tank sat in a small conference room at the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, waiting for his sentencing hearing to begin. The past 90 days had been the longest and most difficult of his life, but also the most important. For the first time since Danny's death, Tank had been forced to confront the man he had become and make serious decisions about the man he wanted to be. The charges against Tank were serious: public intoxication on federal property, disorderly conduct, assault on a federal officer, and desecration of a military grave. The federal prosecutor had initially pushed for the maximum penalties, which could have meant several years in federal prison. Tank's court-appointed attorney had warned him that judges took crimes at Arlington National Cemetery very seriously, especially when they involved violence against tomb guards. But something unexpected had happened in the weeks following Tank's arrest. Sergeant First Class Michael Chen had done something almost unprecedented in his 3 years as a tomb guard. He had requested permission to visit Tank in Nyitum jail and had ultimately written a letter to the court asking for leniency in Tank's sentencing. Tank remembered that first visit clearly. He had been sitting in the visiting room of the Alexandria Detention Center, expecting to see his attorney or maybe his mother, when Chen walked in wearing civilian clothes. Tank's first instinct had been shame. He couldn't look the young soldier in the eye after what he had done at Danny's grave. "Why are you here?" Tank had asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I've been thinking about what you said at your brother's grave," Chen had replied, sitting across from Tank at the metal table. "About how the system failed him, about how your family was forgotten after he died. Some of what you said was wrong, but some of it was true, and I think that's worth talking about." Over the course of 5 visits during Tank's pretrial detention, Chen had shared his own story. He talked about growing up in a military family, about the pressure to serve perfectly and honor the sacrifice of those who came before. He also talked about the doubts he sometimes had. the weight of representing something larger than himself, and the challenge of maintaining faith in institutions that were run by imperfect human beings. More importantly, Chen had listened to Tank's story. Not just the angry version Tank had shouted at Arlington, but the real story of a family destroyed by loss, of a man who had never learned how to process grief in a healthy way. Of 5 years spent drowning in anger because it felt safer than facing the devastating sadness underneath. "Your brother didn't die for nothing," Chen had said during their last visit. "But if you waste the rest of your life being angry about his death, then his sacrifice loses some of its meaning. The best way to honor him is to become the kind of man he would have been proud to call his brother." Those words had started Tank on a journey of self-reflection that was still ongoing. In jail, without alcohol to numb his emotions or anger to distract him from his pain, Tank had been forced to face the reality of what he had lost and what he had become. The process was agonizing, but it was also necessary. Tank had started attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in jail, not because he was required to, but because he finally admitted to himself that his drinking was destroying what was left of his life. He had written letters to his daughter, trying to explain his behavior and asking for her forgiveness. He had called his mother every week, listening to her talk about Danny and slowly learning to share good memories instead of dwelling on anger. Most surprisingly, Tank had begun reading about grief and trauma, trying to understand the psychological process he had been going through for 5 years. He learned that his anger was a normal part of grief, but that he had gotten stuck in that stage instead of moving through it. He learned that many families of fallen soldiers struggled with similar issues, and that there were resources available to help if he was willing to seek them out. Now, as Tank sat in the courthouse waiting for his sentencing, he reflected on how much had changed in 3 months. He wasn't the same man who had drunkenly fought a tomb guard at his brother's grave. That man had been consumed by anger and self-pity, lashing out at anyone who represented the world that had taken Danny away from him. The man sitting in the courthouse was still grieving, still struggling with the unfairness of losing his brother, but he was also sober, getting counseling for his trauma and working to rebuild the relationships his anger had damaged. He had written a letter to the court, accepting full responsibility for his actions and outlining the steps he was taking to address the underlying issues that had led to his breakdown. Tank's attorney entered the conference room, carrying a thick file and wearing an expression that was cautiously optimistic. "The prosecutor has agreed to recommend a plea deal," she said, sitting down across from Tank. "1 year in federal prison, suspended to 6 months if you complete an intensive outpatient program for veterans with trauma and addiction issues. You'll also have to perform 200 hours of community service, specifically at veterans organizations." Tank felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. 6 months in federal prison was serious, but it was far less than the maximum sentence he could have received. More importantly, the plea deal would allow him to get the help he needed while serving his time in a way that might actually honor Danny's memory. "There's something else," his attorney continued. "Sergeant Chen will be testifying at your sentencing hearing. He's going to recommend that the judge accept the plea deal and focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. It's highly unusual for the victim of an assault to advocate for leniency, especially in a case involving Arlington National Cemetery." Tank shook his head in amazement. Even now, months after their confrontation, Chen was still showing him the kind of grace and compassion that Danny would have shown. It was a reminder that there were still good people in the world, people who believed in redemption and second chances. "I want to take the deal," Tank said without hesitation. "And I want to make sure the judge knows how grateful I am for Sergeant Chen's recommendation. That young man showed me more kindness than I deserved." As Tank prepared to enter the courtroom for his sentencing hearing, he thought about the letter he had written to be read aloud during the proceedings. In it, he had tried to explain not just his remorse for his actions, but his commitment to becoming a better person in honor of his brother's memory. Tank had written about his plans to work with other veterans' families dealing with loss and trauma, to share his story as a cautionary tale about how grief can become destructive if left unaddressed. He had written about his desire to volunteer at Arlington National Cemetery, if they would have him, helping to maintain the dignity and respect of the place he had once violated. Most importantly, Tank had written about Danny, not the angry, bitter version of Danny's story that he had carried for 5 years, but the true story of a young man who had served his country with honor and died, believing in something larger than himself. Tank wanted the court to understand that his breakdown at Arlington had been about his own failures, not about any lack of worth in his brother's sacrifice. As the bailiff called Tank's case, he stood up and straightened his shoulders, preparing to face the consequences of his actions with the kind of dignity Danny would have shown. Whatever happened in the next hour, Tank was determined to handle it in a way that would make his brother proud. To their own private moments of remembrance, the peace of the cemetery restored. For the first time in 5 years, Tank felt something other than anger. 2 years after his sentencing, Tank Rodriguez stood at the entrance to Arlington National Cemetery, wearing a crisp white volunteer shirt with his name badge clearly visible. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in September, and he was preparing to lead his weekly tour for Gold Star families, relatives of fallen service, members who were visiting the cemetery for the first time. The transformation in Tank's life had been gradual but profound. He had served his 6 months in federal prison, using the time to complete intensive counseling and addiction treatment programs. Upon his release, he had thrown himself into the community service portion of his sentence, volunteering at veteran support organizations, and sharing his story with other families struggling with grief and trauma. But the most meaningful part of Tank's rehabilitation had been his return to Arlington National Cemetery. After completing his sentence and demonstrating a year of sobriety and community service, Tank had applied to become a volunteer guide at the cemetery. The application process had been rigorous, requiring background checks, interviews, and references from the organizations where he had volunteered. Most importantly, it had required the approval of Sergeant First Class Michael Chen, who was now a supervisor in the Tomb Guard unit. Chen had not only endorsed Tank's application, but had personally vouched for his character and commitment to honoring the memory of America's fallen heroes. Tank's first months as a volunteer had been challenging. Many staff members and regular visitors remembered his arrest and were skeptical about his motivations for returning. Tank had faced that skepticism with patience and humility, understanding that he needed to prove through his actions that he had genuinely changed. Slowly, Tank had built a reputation as one of the cemetery's most knowledgeable and compassionate volunteer guides. He had an intuitive understanding of grief that allowed him to connect with visiting families in ways that other volunteers sometimes couldn't. When a mother broke down crying at her son's grave, Tank knew exactly what to say and when to simply stand quietly and let her grieve. Tank's specialty had become working with Gold Star families, particularly those who were struggling with anger and trauma similar to what he had experienced. The cemetery administration had recognized that Tank's personal experience with loss and recovery made him uniquely qualified to help other families navigate their grief in healthy ways. This morning's tour group consisted of 6 families, all of whom had lost service members within the past 2 years. Tank could see the familiar mixture of sadness, anger, and confusion in their faces as they gathered near the visitor center. He recognized the look because he had worn it himself for so many years. "Good morning, everyone," Tank said, his voice warm but respectful. "My name is Marcus Rodriguez, but most people call me Tank. I'm a volunteer here at Arlington, and I'll be your guide today. Before we begin, I want you to know that I understand what you're going through, because I've been where you are." Tank had learned that honesty about his own experience was the best way to connect with grieving families. He didn't go into all the details of his arrest, but he was open about losing his brother and about the years he had spent struggling with anger and alcohol. "I lost my younger brother Danny 5 years ago in Afghanistan," Tank continued. "For a long time after his death, I was angry at everyone and everything. I was angry at the military, angry at the government, angry at God, and angry at this place. I blamed Arlington for representing everything I thought had failed my brother." A middle-aged woman in the group, whose son had been killed in Iraq 6 months earlier, looked up with recognition in her eyes. Tank could see that she understood exactly what he was talking about. "What I learned through a lot of hard work and help from good people is that my anger was really just grief in disguise," Tank said. "I was so afraid of feeling the sadness of losing Danny that I turned it into rage instead. But anger doesn't honor our loved ones. Love does." Tank led the group through the cemetery, stopping at significant monuments and explaining the history and meaning behind each one. But unlike other tour guides who focus primarily on facts and dates, Tank emphasized the human stories behind the stones and statues. At the tomb of the unknown soldier, Tank introduced the group to Sergeant Chen, who was completing his watch duty. Tank had maintained a friendship with Chen over the past 2 years, meeting monthly for coffee and occasionally bringing their families together for barbecues and holiday celebrations. Sergeant Chen represents everything that's best about military service, Tank told the group. He showed me that it's possible to honor our fallen heroes while still acknowledging the human cost of war. He taught me that respect and grief can coexist, and that this place is meant to be a source of comfort, not anger. Chen, still in his immaculate dress uniform, spoke briefly to the group about the significance of the tomb and the commitment of the guards who watched over it. When one of the fathers asked about dealing with anger over his son's death, Chen looked at Tank and nodded. Anger is a normal part of grief, Tank said, stepping forward, but it becomes dangerous when it's all we feel. Our loved ones didn't serve so that we could spend the rest of our lives being bitter. They served because they believed in something better, and the best way we can honor them is to work toward that better world they died defending. The tour continued to Section 60, where many recent casualties were buried. Tank watched as each family found their loved one's grave and began their private moments of remembrance. He stayed nearby, available if anyone needed support, but giving them space to grieve in their own way. One young widow approached Tank as her toddler son played quietly near his father's headstone. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you come here every week and help other people when it must bring up your own pain?" Tank looked over at Danny's grave, visible from where they stood. He visited his brother every week now, but the visits were different than they had been during his years of anger. Now he came to share good memories, to update Danny on his life, and to ask for strength to continue helping other families. "It doesn't take away the pain," Tank said honestly. "I still miss my brother every single day, and I still get sad about all the things he'll never get to do. But helping other families helps me feel like Danny's death has meaning beyond just the sadness it caused." Tank paused, choosing his words carefully. "When I help a family learn to grieve in a healthy way, when I see someone choose love over anger, I feel like I'm continuing the work Danny started. He always helped people, always made things better wherever he went. Now I get to do that too in his memory." As the tour concluded, several families thanked Tank for his honesty and insight. The middle-aged woman whose son had died in Iraq asked if she could contact Tank for ongoing support, and Tank gladly gave her his information through the cemetery's volunteer coordinator. Tank walked back to Danny's grave after the families had departed, carrying fresh flowers as he did every week. He knelt beside the headstone, which gleamed white in the afternoon sun, completely clean and dignified. "Hey, little brother," Tank said quietly. "Had a good group today. I think we helped some people find a little peace. I hope that makes you proud." Tank arranged the flowers carefully, then sat back on his heels and looked around at the peaceful cemetery. The anger that had consumed him for so many years was gone, replaced by something more sustainable and more meaningful, a sense of purpose rooted in love rather than rage. Tank's phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter, who was now a college sophomore majoring in social work. She was planning to visit for Thanksgiving, their relationship fully healed after years of patient work to rebuild trust and connection. His mother was doing better too, finding comfort in Tank's recovery and in the volunteer work they now did together at veteran support organizations. As Tank stood to leave, he noticed Sergeant Chen approaching from the direction of the tomb. Even off duty, Chen's posture remained perfectly military, but his expression was relaxed and friendly. "Good tour today," Chen said, falling into step beside Tank as they walked toward the cemetery exit. "I could see you really connected with that group." Tank nodded. "That's the goal. I just try to remember what I needed to hear during those dark years, and hope it helps someone else avoid the mistakes I made." "You know," Chen said thoughtfully, "what happened between us that day changed both of our lives. I learned something about compassion and second chances that made me a better soldier and a better person." Tank stopped walking and looked at his friend with surprise. "I never thought about it affecting you. I was so focused on my own growth and recovery." "That's what real transformation looks like," Chen replied. "When someone genuinely changes, it creates ripples that touch everyone around them. Your brother would be proud of the man you've become. Tank, I'm proud to call you my friend." As Tank drove home on his motorcycle, the same Harley-Davidson he had ridden to Arlington 5 years earlier, He reflected on the journey that had brought him from rage to peace. The road had been long and difficult, requiring him to face painful truths about himself and make fundamental changes to how he approached life. But Tank had learned that healing was possible, that love was stronger than anger, and that even the most broken person could find a way to honor their loved ones through service to others. Danny's death would always be a loss, but it no longer felt like a waste. Through Tank's work at Arlington and his dedication to helping other grieving families, Danny's memory lived on in countless acts of compassion and healing. Tank smiled as he thought about the text he would send to his daughter that evening, sharing the highlights of his day and asking about her upcoming midterm exams. Life was good again, not in spite of Danny's death, but because Tank had finally learned to carry his brother's memory in a way that created light instead of darkness. The transformation was complete, but the work would continue for the rest of Tank's life, and he couldn't imagine anything that would make Danny prouder. Share.